Welcome back to TinyBlueGames. My name is, of course, Csaw or Chris, and today we're talking about Final Fantasy XIV in 2021. Today we are doing a quick video that's going to highlight some of the major differences you might find if you are trying Final Fantasy XIV for the first time, or if you're coming back to the game after having tried to get into it before and it didn't really stick. Now, I'm making this video because if you've been following along the channel, you'll know that I've recently completed Heavensward, which is the first expansion of the game, and I was putting together a review for this expansion, which is still ongoing, and is probably going to be a bit of a longer video. But throughout doing that, I kept coming to these points where I was like, oh, this is such a different thing, and I don't know how I explain it to someone who's never played Final Fantasy XIV before, and I was like, that might make a video on its own. I think it's also an important time to do this because whenever there is a Final Fantasy XIV fan fest, and obviously there's the trailer for the new expansion, there's a lot of excitement for Final Fantasy, and we see a lot of people who are coming from these games that have kind of dead periods going on, you know, looking at you, Shadowlands. So that's definitely something that I thought would make this video particularly meaningful for the community. With all that said, let's dive into some of the biggest differences you'll notice when trying Final Fantasy XIV for the first time. Now, the first of these that I want to talk about is probably the one that most people know if they know anything about Final Fantasy XIV, and that is the job or class system. So when I'm saying jobs or classes, I mean the different types of characters like wizard or lancer or hunter or thief. You know, they're common in most MMOs. Most games call them classes, this game calls them jobs, so we'll refer to them as jobs as we progress through this video. Now, the big change here is that unlike most MMOs, you're able to have multiple jobs on your single character. And this is a very powerful thing because unlike most MMOs, when you want to try that cool job that you see launching fireballs or something like that, you don't have to go create a new character, level the character to max level, jump through Covenant-sized hoops if you're playing a game like that, to be able to try out the class. You get to just swap. And I should clarify that you do have to still level the job. You have to level it up to whatever the max level is, but once you have it leveled, you can swap between the jobs and you keep that level, so you always have that job unlocked, which is super, super powerful. It's also great because it adds a level of excitement to different parts of the game that might eventually get tiring. For instance, what I'm doing as I level through the game is I'm trying a different job for each expansion, and this is great because it allows me to fit in thematically with each expansion, which is really cool, but it allows for a bit of fresh air in between each expansion, and it allows me to learn new things. It's also great because I'll have knowledge of multiple different jobs once I get to max level, and I'll be able to make more of an informed decision about which job I want to try and gear up. Now, it's pretty easy to change jobs. You just simply change out your weapons. For instance, if you're going from Dragoon to Summoner, you switch out your Lance thingy for a book thingy, and you're good to go. You can't do this in combat, so it has to be out of combat, but apart from that, it's really quick to do, and it's probably one of my favorite features in the game. From there, we're moving on to probably the second most known feature of Final Fantasy XIV, and that is the quests/story/main scenario quest. And this feature is probably a little bit less positive, or at least seen a little bit less positively by the MMO community, and that's because to a lot of people it seems tedious. And don't get me wrong, it can be tedious, and it can be one of the hardest things for new players to cope with, but it's also one of the best parts of the game if you allow it to be. So the game has main scenario quests that you need to play through in order to progress and enjoy all parts of the game. Unlike other MMOs like Guild Wars 2 and The Elder Scrolls Online, yada yada yada, where you are free to do whatever your heart desires to reach endgame, Final Fantasy is a little bit more strict. There are quests that guide you through the game and really control where you go and the pace of your leveling. Now, the constraining nature of this can be challenging and was probably one of the biggest shocks when I came to Final Fantasy XIV. However, there is a lot of good that comes out of the system. The devs know people are going to be playing through this, they know that the story is going to be told through this, and because of that, they put a lot of resources into the main scenario quest. Unlike certain other games that you could mention, where the story is maybe forgotten about and kind of like put on the shelf, and if there's any extra money, yeah, maybe we'll put a few bucks there. The story in Final Fantasy XIV is breathtaking at points, and if you really get immersed into it, it can be quite the adventure. Now, is it the best story ever told? No. Most of the best stories ever told, I find, are in books. However, it is one of the best stories I've ever seen in a video game, and specifically in an MMO. It's really quite engaging, and if you really get connected to a lot of the characters, I think you'll enjoy it a fair bit. My advice is to take it slow and enjoy it. You can try and rush, but it will just make things more tedious, because you get into the cycle where you skip quests and then you have no idea what's going on in the story, and because of that, things seem more tedious, and it's a vicious cycle that gets worse and worse and worse. And I think most people who don't make it through the initial Realm Reborn, it's because of this tediousness that they kind of subject themselves to. Now, I should note that like most MMOs in this day and age, you do have options to boost, or in this instance, skip parts of the story if you really don't fancy it. But unless you've already been through the story on a different character, and this is like an alt or something like that, I truly recommend that you do go through it. Because at the end of the day, if you don't enjoy the main scenario quest, you're going to be getting a lot less game for your sub fee than people who are playing this content. It's a big part of the game, and if it's something that doesn't appeal to you, no matter how you play it, Final Fantasy XIV might just not work for you, and that's completely fine. It's just something that you should know. This leads me to my next point, which is pacing. This difference is a little more vague and might honestly be influenced more by my own playstyle than anything else, but I find the pace in which you move through the game to be a bit slower. I think this is a good thing, but it will initially feel like a bad thing. See, MMOs have pushed us to this world where everyone wants to rush to endgame and start improving their characters as quickly as possible. It's no longer about the journey, but ultimately about the destination. This isn't all on games, it's also a bit about the players ourselves. We have become more mature when it comes to our knowledge of MMOs, and because of that, we know the general cycle. We know that you level and then eventually you get to endgame, where there are these different types of content where the real quote-unquote challenge begins. And if you're after the most challenging content in the game, that's usually how things work, and maybe it is best for you to rush there and join your friends and do it that way. But I think there's a lot that you're missing out on if you don't take the time to look. The true issue with this is if you rush to a specific piece of content, you miss out on so much other content that you might really love. The beauty of the main scenario quest forcing players to relive the story and areas of each expansion is that it allows for more instances of people stopping and smelling the roses and really falling in love with different aspects of the game. Unlike almost every MMO that I've leveled in the past few years, I actually ran raids, in this case the Binding Coil and the Crystal Tower, that aren't in the current content. And these raids were very interesting because they allowed me to see parts of the story and character development that I wouldn't have otherwise seen, and those pieces of character development really paid off already, even in the next expansion, which was Heavensward. So it's really important to actually take your time and see all these different pieces. And I think so many games now, when I think of World of Warcraft and your ability to pretty much pick one or two different expansions to play through, there's so much content and lore that new players specifically aren't going to see. And if the newest expansion talks about content from those expansions or the stories, they're going to really miss out on so much of the backstory. And the other side of the coin then is that the game has to educate those players on the lore. So veterans of the game have to deal with all these really basic summaries of things that they already know just to educate everyone and have everyone on the same playing field. Whereas in Final Fantasy XIV, the devs know that people have played through the main scenario quest, they know that they have that story, and that these little side pieces of content just add like sprinkles of flavor to it. It's similar to Guild Wars 2 in that sense. It does have its, living story that is essentially the main scenario quests, and then has side stories that are told through different raids and different instances and stuff like that. So it's a really good system that encourages people to explore, but also shows you where the main story lies. Now, the idea of exploring and seeing all that the game has to offer also leads us to unlock quests, or blue quests if you prefer. While traveling through the game, you will see many different quests, and we've already touched on some of them, such as the main scenario quest, but there are also these blue icons that have little pluses on them. These quests are very important as they actually unlock features in the game that you won't have access to before you finish them. Remember how we mentioned that you can have all the different jobs on one character? Well, this is how you go and acquire these different jobs. You go and find these little blue quests, and with that you can have access to the job. Now, there are also job quests, which will then give a sort of side story for your specific job, which is super cool. That didn't quite make the list, but this is a honorable mention here. Definitely one of the coolest parts of classes in this game is that there is story that is developed through each expansion for each of the jobs, but that's an aside. The other things you can unlock through these quests are things like, dyeing your armor, different emotes, different ways of traveling, and even different dungeons that aren't tied to the main scenario quest can be unlocked through these quests, and they're not usually that complicated. Usually you have to accept the quest in one of the main towns of the expansion. Maybe you'll do a little bit of investigating, or you'll talk to a few different people that are having issues in this weird cave that might be infested with dragons or something like that, and then you go and travel to the cave itself, and there will be someone standing outside that will reward you with access to the dungeon. Once you have access to it, you join it like you do every other dungeon through the group finder, so it's nothing crazy, but it's definitely something to keep in mind as you're exploring in the world, because there's so many little things that you could miss. Now, the other side of this is that there are a ton of quests. If you were going into the world and you were trying to smell the roses and explore every little nook and cranny, you're gonna be in places forever. So in terms of priorities, you do the main scenario quests, and then any blue quest with a plus on it, it's worth stopping and seeing what it's about and if it's worth unlocking. And then other side quests you can probably leave to either do if you're leveling an alt job or something like that. Leave it for a different time. So that's kind of the priority I'd use as you go through it. You definitely can stop and check everything out if that's who you want to be, but you could end up being even slower than me, which really says a lot. The last part I wanted to talk about is the music. Now, for some people, I know music isn't a huge part of an MMORPG, or at least maybe not a noticeable part. Oftentimes, the music is just background music, and it fades into the background, as you might expect, and because of that, it doesn't do much more than just fill the silence. It makes games more whole, and that's true for Final Fantasy XIV, but I'd say it brings it to another level. In the game, there's some very different music that you might not be used to, and at first, like a lot of these things, it might be a bit jarring. Just wait until you fight Titan for the first time and start jamming out to guitar instead of dodging attacks or whatever you should be doing. It's magic. I guess my big takeaway here is just to keep your music on and keep listening to it as you level, because you never know when you're going to fall in love with the next song. And it's something that's particularly special because when going into new trials or new dungeons, new fights, instead of just wondering what the boss is going to look like, what the fight's going to be like, what gear drops, what the actual arena might look like, I'm actually wondering what the music is going to be like. And I don't think there's ever been a game that's made me think that before. The music also makes the fight itself like 1,000 times more interesting, because it actually transitions with different phases and adds these really epic moments where you feel like you are doing something truly awesome, and it can only be amplified by that music at the same time. So all this said, just keep listening to your music as you go through the game. But yeah, that's all I got for this video. I hopefully made this quick enough. I was trying to not take too long because I do talk about this in other videos, but I wanted to kind of condense it into one video and highlight my key differences that you might notice when you play the game. This is definitely not all of the differences you're going to notice in Final Fantasy XIV. This is just the tip of the iceberg. So if anyone has different things they want to talk about in the comments, I do encourage to share those with other players, because I really do think it helps out for new players who are coming in and they're like, this felt really weird. Should it feel this weird? Or like, do I not like the game just because of this piece that I wasn't prepared for? I think it's really great to shape expectations before going into the game itself. But yeah, if you enjoyed this video, please consider tossing it a like, and if you're in the market for MMO content and Final Fantasy XIV content, please consider subscribing to the channel. We'd love to have you here. But thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.